Today we're going to make a meal from a Victorian workhouse, and while novels like Oliver Twist might have you think that all they ever ate was watery gruel, and they did eat gruel mostly for breakfast, for dinner you might get something a little bit more interesting, like this dish of scouse and suet dumplings. So thank you to Hungry Root for sponsoring this video as we examine just exactly how terrible the food in a Victorian workhouse really was. This time on Tasting History. During the Victorian era, workhouses in Britain were nothing new. They had been around for a couple centuries. What did change were the laws governing them. Something called the New Poor Law, as opposed to the Old Poor Law, transitioned these institutions from a place of charity to a place of, if not exactly punishment, to a place of last resort for relief. It was believed that if the workhouse was too comfortable, it would actually entice people to become poor or stay poor just for the free handout. Not that it was exactly free, seeing as you were doing backbreaking work for 10 to 12 hours a day, but still, they considered it a handout. But even in the Victorian era, there were still guidelines of what kind of food to feed the inmates, and that is what they were called, inmates. It was often gruel and a bit of bread and beer for breakfast, then bread and cheese for supper, and in the middle of the day, for dinner, a person could expect a little meat and potato or a stew along with some suet dumplings or pudding. So I found two recipes meant to be made at workhouses of the Victorian era. One is for a stew, a meat stew called scouse, and the other is for suet dumplings. So the first, for the scouse, it comes from the Manual for Workhouse Cookery from 1901, and it provides a detailed list of the exact ingredients and quantities to make it. So I'm going to use those, but it only makes one serving, so I'm going to triple it, but the ratios will all be the same. So for the scouse, what you'll need is 1 pound or 450 grams of beef, 3/4 of a cup or 90 grams of flour, 3 tablespoons or 42 grams of butter or other fat, 340 grams or about 4 small potatoes, 255 grams or 2 large carrots, 85 grams or about a half of a small turnip, and 45 grams or a half cup of diced onion. Then 2 teaspoons of salt and a half teaspoon of pepper. Then the recipe says to cut up the meat and vegetables, fry the flour in the fat till brown, stir in the water, add pepper and salt, then put in the meat and vegetables. Simmer gently for 2 hours to make 1 pint of stew. Now let's make some workhouse scouse. So start by chopping up the meat and vegetables. Also, as the workhouse was all about economy, you don't want to peel the potatoes, carrots, and turnips. You just want them to be washed and chopped up. Then we move on to making the soup's thickener by melting the butter in a large pot, then adding in the flour and mixing it together. It's sort of like a very low-fat roux because instead of the usual 1-to-1 ratio of flour to fat, this one has more of a 2-to-1 ratio, twice as much flour than fat. And that means it can be rather dry, and so really you need to keep stirring it around so it doesn't burn. So keep it moving over a medium heat for about 5 minutes until it does finally start to brown but not burn. And then you can pour in a little more than 7 cups of water. The exact recipe would call for 3 imperial pints or 1,700 milliliters. Then give it a good stir and let that come to a simmer, at which point the thickener should dissolve fairly well. Then add in the pepper and the salt, followed by the meat and the vegetables. And give it another good stir and let it return to a simmer, and then place the lid on the pot and let it cook for 2 hours. And every once in a while, give it a good stir and kind of scrape the bottom to make sure nothing is burning to the bottom of the pot. And then really, it's actually ready to eat as is. But if you want some extra energy, if you're breaking up stones into gravel to pave the roads of Britain in a workhouse, then I suggest making some suet dumplings. And so for that, we look to a Scottish book on the management of poorhouses of all sorts, where a Miss F.A. Merchant provides a recipe which calls for 6 ounces of flour, 2 ounces chopped suet, 1/16 ounce baking powder, 3/4 ounce chopped parsley, salt and pepper. Mix all the dry things, rubbing the suet through the flour. Make into a firm paste with the cold water. Divide into 10 or 12 small pieces, which roll up into balls, having the outsides well floured. Drop the balls into the stew and cook for half an hour longer, then serve. And to make these, what you'll need is just under 1.5 cups or 170 grams of flour, and then a heaping 1/3 cup or 55 grams of beef suet. And if you can't find beef suet, that you can get it online, you can use really cold butter. Then a half teaspoon baking powder, 1 teaspoon of salt, a half teaspoon of pepper, and 21 grams of chopped parsley. That is a lot of parsley. It's actually like an entire bunch of parsley if you're just using the leaves, and then when they're chopped really fine, it's about a cup of parsley. So mix the salt, pepper, and baking powder into the flour, and then add the parsley and mix. Once well distributed, you can add the suet, and you want to work that in by rubbing it into the flour with your fingers. And once it is well incorporated, you can add some cold water. I would start with about a 1/4 cup of water and only add more if you need it. You want it to be just enough that the dough comes together and can be formed into balls. You're going to make about 10 to 12 dumplings. Once you've rolled your dumplings, you can coat them in a layer of flour, and then 30 minutes before your scouse is done, or about an hour and a half into the cooking, you can add your dumplings into the stew. Gently stir them in so you don't break them up, but you get them nice and coated with the liquid, and then return the lid to the pot and cook for another 30 minutes. And then you can make sure that you're subscribed to Tasting History, hit the like button, it really does help out the channel, and we can take a closer look at the food of a Victorian workhouse and decide if it really was as bad as Oliver Twist would have us believe. So I have a book recommendation to start this off with. It is called The Workhouse Cookbook by Peter Higginbottom. It is a super deep dive into this topic, and it is absolutely worth a read. Now, to discuss Victorian workhouses, we really need to go back and see why workhouses existed in the first place. And to answer that, we have to go back to one of the most important years in all of British history, 1536. This was the beginning of what was known as the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII. Now, poverty had of course always existed in Britain, but for centuries, the degree of homelessness was actually kept at bay because there was a system of charity set up through the monasteries. People could go for alms or sometimes even a bed. But when, in just a few years, those monasteries disappeared, that safety net went with them. Over the next few decades, the amount of beggars on the streets of Britain skyrocketed, and to combat that, the government did things like ban giving alms directly to them, and instead all alms, or help for the poor, had to go through the church common box. And as it happened, a lot of that money never actually made it to the people that it was supposed to be helping. So there was a new system, at least in some cities like Colchester, York, and London, that was set up that was essentially a tax to help the poor. This started in the 1550s, and again, it wasn't meant to go directly to people, but rather to prop up institutions that would help people. See, new vagrancy laws like the Vagabonds Act of 1572 and later the Poor Relief Act of 1601 effectively made it illegal to be homeless. And so you would be taken in by one of a series of new establishments. If you were mentally ill, this meant you would go to a hospital or asylum, the most famous being the Bethlehem or Bethlehem Hospital, also known as Bedlam. Then there were poorhouses for those who were too old to work, or jail or prison for those who refused to work, those who were known as the idle poor. And for those who could and were willing to work, the able-bodied poor, there was the workhouse. Now, the workhouse was not meant to be a punishment, but rather an act of charity that would help lift you out of poverty until you can move along your way. It wasn't exactly anyone's first choice, but it wasn't the worst option out there. In 1732, it was written, "It is remarkable that all the parishes in Southwark except St. Thomas's have set up large workhouses for the reception of their numerous poor, which are so well regulated that as fast as there is any vacancy, interest is made by the poor themselves to be admitted." In those years, the work tended to be that of spinning flax, hemp, and wool, and the food was simple, but not far off from what the majority of the population was eating, with plenty of porridge, bread, cheese, and beer, along with some roast or boiled meat, and even plum pudding once a week. And if you should fall sick while in the house, you'd actually be given claret or wine, fish, oysters, or even chocolate to help cure you. Of course, just like with any institution, the quality varied depending on where you were and who was running it. In the early 1700s, there was a man named Matthew Marriott who ran a few of these workhouses, and he kept gathering more and more, and eventually had basically a monopoly on an entire area of the country with these workhouses. And as he gained that monopoly, quality went down, as is often the case, and a lot of issues ended up happening. There were incidents of torture and starvation and all of those kinds of things. And it culminated in a famous ballad, a song written about a woman who actually died in one of the workhouses. The song, which came out in 1731, was called The Workhouse Cruelty, and it was about a woman named Mary Whistle, who was a housekeeper who lost her position and eventually found herself having to enter the workhouse. And there, she did something to offend the governor who was in charge of the workhouse. It's not specific what she did or what he did, but they threw her down into the basement. There for 11 weeks, poor soul, she lay, half-starved, ate up with vermin, as they say. Holes in her legs, her arms, her hips, her thighs, the vermin eat, and in her head likewise. So essentially she died and was eaten by rats. It's really quite sad, and it became an incredible hit throughout Britain, and it actually had consequences for Matthew Marriott, who was stripped of his power over all these workhouses and ended up dying the next year. Now, it is during this period, the 18th century, that many people's perception of the poor starts to change, and it is best exemplified by the perception of two drinks of the period, one being beer, the other gin. Beer, typically low-alcoholic small beer, was the drink of choice for most of society, and in workhouses, men got 2 pints a day, and women and children got 1. Though if you were engaged in hard labor, you would actually receive more. At one workhouse in Suffolk, the washerwomen received 8 pints a day. Beer was a wholesome drink and is depicted in William Hogarth's 1751 print Beer Street, which shows prosperous and productive members of society all drinking beer. But gin, a new and obviously much stronger drink, had recently come on the scene, and I actually did an entire video all about the London gin craze, so I'll put a link to that in the description. But essentially, it was very quickly seen as a drink for the poor and the dregs of society, and a sinful drink. And it is shown in Hogarth's other print, Gin Lane, where London's poor live in squalor. They're fighting dogs for bones, neglecting their children, and then just dying in poverty. And one account from 1725 says that many of the poor chose to struggle with their necessities and to continue in a starving condition with the liberty of haunting the brandy shops and such like houses, rather than submit to live regularly in plenty. In that quote, it was brandy, but very soon it would be gin that would become the leading culprit. They chose to drink gin. They chose to live like this. They chose to be poor. That became the thought. Before this, very often the poor were called unfortunates, meaning that they were poor, yes, but it wasn't anything that they did. It was fortune, literally, just circumstance that made them poor. But as the 18th century came to a close, it began to be seen that it was not fortune that did this, but rather their own iniquity that made them poor. This led to a change in how the poor were treated, especially in these institutions. It went from being charity to being more of a punishment, to trying to change their behavior by making things so uncomfortable in the workhouses that they would simply choose not to be in them, choose not to be poor anymore. It was very much the mindset of Ebenezer Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, but that comes because that was very much the mindset of much of Victorian society. And this view was essentially written into law in 1834 with what was known as the New Poor Law. Here, the work in the workhouses really changed. While some people still did laundry and tailoring, shoemaking, basket weaving, there were a lot more harsher forms of work like bricklaying, chopping wood, or even stone breaking became common. There was even the literal bone-crushing work of crushing bones to be made into fertilizer. Animal bones, not your bones, but still bone crushing. This period also saw a standardization in the cuisine served to the inmates in poorhouses, because at some of the poorhouses, namely rural locations, it was seen that they were eating too well, something known as pot-bellied philanthropy. These new laws enshrined something called the principle of less eligibility, which basically dictated that no aspect of life in the workhouse, including the food, should be superior or equal to the ordinary mode of subsistence of the laboring classes of the neighborhood. The worry was, if you feed them well, it will entice people to want to become poor or stay poor and live in these workhouses. And so, in 1835, the Poor Law Commissioner Charles Mott laid out daily diets for men, women, children under 9, and those people over 60. And it's not like he was being particularly cruel as he set up this diet. He just wanted it to be standardized and to make sure that people had just enough calories that would allow them to do the work that they were supposed to do in the workhouse. The new system gave able-bodied men 6 ounces of bread and 1.5 pints of gruel for breakfast, 5 ounces of meat and a half pound of potatoes, or 1.5 pints of soup for dinner, plus a little suet and rice pudding once a week. Then for supper, it was 6 ounces of bread and either some broth or 2 ounces of cheese. Then women received roughly the same thing, though only 5 ounces of bread instead of 6. Now, on the face of it, this lineup of meals really seems quite nutritious and more or as much as most people in Britain were getting. But while the quantity might have been there, the quality, it turns out, was absolutely not. When Charles Shaw wrote about his childhood in a workhouse in Staffordshire in the 1840s, he described his first encounter with workhouse skilly, the local term for gruel. I had heard of workhouse skilly, but had never before seen it. I had had poor food before this, but never any so offensively poor as this. By what rare culinary-making nausea and bottomless fatuitousness it could be made so sickening I never could make out. Simple meal and water, however small the amount of meal, honestly boiled, would be palatable. But this decoction of meal and water and mustiness and fustiness was most revolting to any healthy state. It might have been boiled in old clothes which had been worn upon sweating bodies for 80 years and 10. That workhouse skilly was the vilest compound I ever tasted, unutterably insipid, and it might never have been made in a country where either sugar or salt was known. And when a surgeon visited the Sheffield Union workhouse, he recalled that I was invited to taste the dinner of the day, which happened to be soup. I was rash enough to take a breakfast cupful, with a piece of their excellent bread, and I paid the penalty of a severe attack of indigestion. Black beetles are a great nuisance and occasionally get into the food, but vigorous steps are being taken to decimate them. Now, workhouse officials, called guardians, tried to make it so that the public didn't really know about how horrible the conditions could be. They would do things like invite newspapermen in to view the workhouse and give them food, but they would do so only in the best fashion, and they would clean everything just like I do when I have company over, so nobody can see how I actually live. This, of course, would lead to write-ups in newspapers, like in 1841, that said the inmates have recently dined. We taste the food which has constituted their meal, and we acknowledge that the suet pudding, the bread, and the cheese are, in quality, equal to what may be found in the larders of the wealthiest. Sure, Jan. But the public was, of course, not fooled, because too many real people were going in and out of the workhouses to keep that kind of thing under wraps. And so you get novels like Oliver Twist. Though one of my favorite chastisements of the food in the workhouse was actually printed in 1838 in newspapers across the country, and it is absolutely brilliant. It is a rewording of Act 4, Scene 1 of the play Macbeth, one of my favorite plays. It's the scene where the 3 witches are over the cauldron brewing something, and they say, "Double, double, toil and trouble." Instead of 3 witches, though, it's 3 guardians of the workhouse making food for the inmates. "Thrice hath the dying pauper groaned, and once his starveling child hath moaned. Rotgut cries, 'Tis time, 'tis time. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire burn and cauldron bubble, shell of oyster, chicken's claw, duckling's entrails, turkey's maw, measled pork and mouldy meal, clods and stickings, greasy heel. Here I have a strangled mole, lately taken from his hole. Add thereto the back of ferret, round about the cauldron stare it. Black gruel and white, green gruel and grey, mingle, 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 they that eat it may. Now for water, make it thin, put of that a plenty in, that will make the paupers grin. I obviously didn't read the whole thing, it's really quite long, but all quite brilliant, so I'll actually include that in the next Tasting History newsletter, which you can sign up for at tastinghistory.com. Now this and other public works, like Oliver Twist, actually did lead to public outcries, and there were occasional attempts at reforming the workhouses, but they never really stuck, because even as late as the 1890s, when a British politician named George Lansbury visited a workhouse in an official capacity, sort of an inspector, a post known as a guardian of the poor, he wrote that the food was mainly skilly, bread, margarine, cheese, and hard, tough meat and vegetables, and occasionally doses of salted, dried fish. On one visit, I inspected the supper of oatmeal porridge. On this occasion, the food was served up with pieces of black stuff floating around. On examination, we discovered it to be rat and mice manure. I called for the chief officer, who immediately argued against me, saying the porridge was good and wholesome. "Very good, madam," said I, taking up a basinful and a spoon. "Here you are. Eat one mouthful, and I will acknowledge I am wrong." "Oh dear, no," said the fine lady. "The food is not for me, and is good and wholesome enough for those who want it." I stamped and shouted around till both doctor and master arrived, both of whom pleaded it was all a mistake, and promptly served cocoa and bread and margarine. There was one scandal which really raised a collective eyebrow that took place in March of 1897 when a Mr. John Loeb, or Loeb, I'm not sure how he pronounced it, who was on the board of governors for one of the workhouses, decided that they should not probably, after every single weekly meeting, have an entire dinner within feet of the very poorly fed paupers who were living in the workhouse. He thought a lunch should be just fine. He felt that the business occupying an hour and a half does not justify a dinner consisting of fish of 3 kinds, joints of mutton or beef, poultry, a variety of puddings and sweets, cheese, butter, biscuits, and celery, with a selection of hock, claret, champagne, and whiskey. Neither does he think that a dessert of pineapples, almonds, and raisins is warranted by the proceedings. The knowledge that the guardian's table groans under plenty, whilst the inmates have to content themselves with the fare of the workhouse, he says, accentuates discontent, envy, and hatred, and is subversive of the discipline of the institution. Mr. Loeb has no objection to the light luncheon, but he thinks that the dinners at the house should be stopped. A vote was taken, and of course, Mr. Loeb's proposal was very soundly defeated, and the grand dinners continued. It wasn't until 1929 that the workhouses began to close and new forms of public assistance began to replace them in British society. But before we hurrah the closure of the workhouse, let us try to eat one of the meals that those inside would have eaten, minus the rat droppings. So after that half hour of cooking, the dumplings should have puffed up nicely and the stew is ready to serve. And here we are, scouse and suet dumplings from a Victorian workhouse. So is it the prettiest dish you ever done seen? Absolutely not. It really doesn't look super appetizing, but it doesn't smell bad. In fact, it smells quite good. I mean, it's just meat and vegetables, right? So here we go. This is a lot thicker than I thought it would be. It's actually quite good. I mean, it's really thick stew with vegetables and meat. I mean, it tastes just like a regular meat stew. I don't know what I was expecting, but it's very good. Let me try one of the dumplings here. So the dumplings are very thick, a little fluffy, but also kind of dense. Here we go. Delicious. Doesn't taste of parsley at all, which is surprising. So much parsley. Not gonna lie, this is actually really good. I'm gonna eat this whole bowl. Yep. Now this experiment does not mean to say that the food at the workhouse was good, because while the ingredients themselves, or rather the dish itself is good, it really depends on the quality of the ingredients. And there are records of pieces of meat being so tough that they were inedible, and instead that they would use them outside, basically like you would a tennis ball, kind of throwing it around. Often the flour had bugs and weevils in it, or rat droppings. It could be, semi-rotten vegetables. A lot of times they would have a lot more water in it, so it wouldn't be really thick. It would just be watery, and you're barely getting anything. So depends on where you are, when you are, who's in charge, and yeah, it's a nice thing that the workhouses don't exist anymore. So as I mentioned, I did do a video on gin a while back, and it's actually one of my favorite videos. I also did a wonderful video on gruel. I'm patting myself on the back here. Did an excellent video on gruel, so I'll put links to both gruel and gin videos down in the description, and I will see you next time on Tasting. During the American Civil War, life as a POW was no picnic, and a big part of people's misery was the food. Whether you were scrounging for vermin in a Union prison on Lake Erie, or flat out starving in the infamous Andersonville prison in Georgia. But on occasion, there were glimmers of decent food to be had, like this mock apple pie that I'm making using a recipe from 1863. So thank you to Factor for sponsoring this video as we look at the meager foods of a Civil War prison. This time on Tasting History. Now before we start with our mock apple pie, I just wanted to thank everyone for watching Tasting History every Tuesday and subscribing, because the channel just hit 2.5 million subscribers, and yeah, who knew that there were so many food history lovers out there? Not I. So thank you for subscribing, for supporting the channel, for buying my book, the Tasting History Cookbook, and yeah, now on to some Civil War prison food. Not the best segue. But if there is one thing that pretty much everyone knows about prisons during the Civil War, it's that the food sucked, or was non-existent. And so when I was trying to figure out what dish I was going to make for this episode, I came across some roadblocks because I didn't want to give myself dysentery. Luckily, I did find out that if you were an officer in many of the prisons, the food wasn't that bad. For instance, at Fort Warren in Boston, Confederate Major Thomas Sparrow wrote a letter to his wife on December 8, 1861, saying that our closet is never without crackers, cheese, bologna, sausage, fruit cake, plain cake, coffee, tea. And on Johnson's Island, located in Lake Erie just off of Sandusky, Ohio, they allowed Confederate prisoners, at least the officers, to get care packages from home. And there was one man, Lieutenant Colonel John Inzer of Alabama, who really took advantage of this, receiving in 1 month at least 3 different care packages from 3 different women. One of them included 6 pounds of sugar, 3 pounds coffee, 3 cans milk, 3 tomatoes, 1 box mustard, 3 papers pepper, 5 pounds butter, 20 pounds meal, and 25 pounds flour, ham, onions, dried fruit. I am not sure what papers pepper is. I tried to do some research and nothing came up. I'm wondering if pepper was sold in like paper sachets. Not entirely sure. Anyway, other boxes that he received included things like strawberries and cucumbers and different cakes and pies. And it is the pie mentioned that got me making some pie today. But as it was wartime and these care packages were coming from the home front, food was scarce, especially down south. And so I'm going to be making a recipe from an 1863 Confederate receipt book, a compilation of over 100 receipts adapted to the times. Apple pie without apples. To 1 small bowl of crackers that have been soaked until no hard parts remain, add 1 teaspoonful of tartaric acid, sweeten to your taste, add some butter, and a very little nutmeg. And you'll note that this is a very poorly written recipe, as are many historic recipes. There are very few measurements, there's no mention of any kind of crust, and it doesn't tell you how to cook it. Do you bake it? Is it done raw? It's probably not. It is probably baked, but it doesn't actually say that. So I am going to be also looking at some later mock apple pie recipes to fill in the gaps. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 1 teaspoon of tartaric acid, 1 cup or 200 grams of brown sugar, 2 tablespoons of butter, a half teaspoon of nutmeg, and some crackers, about enough to make 2 cups when crushed up. But what kind of crackers? because crackers then are not like crackers now. Now, there are later recipes, again from mock apple pie, that use Ritz crackers, but those recipes were put out during the Great Depression by Ritz crackers, and Ritz crackers did not exist at this time. So they were probably a much more plain cracker, similar to pilot bread or hardtack. But if you don't have any of that, you can also just use some club crackers. They'll probably taste better too. So break up your crackers and put them in a bowl and cover with water and let them sit until they soften. Mine took a couple hours, though club crackers take about 10 seconds. While they soften, whisk together the brown sugar, tartaric acid, and nutmeg, and add in the butter. So drain the crackers and give them a good mashing, and then add in the sugar mixture and mix. And that is all that the recipe actually says to do. So we gotta figure out what to do for a crust and how to bake it, how long to bake it. I don't know, it's gonna take some trial and error. And that is why, after a full day of cooking stuff like this, sometimes I just don't feel like cooking myself dinner, but what crust are we going to make? Well, luckily, this book did have several recipes for unorthodox crusts. The one I'm using is for potato crust. Boil 6 good-sized mealy potatoes and mash them fine. Add salt, a spoonful of butter, and 2 of water while they are hot. Then work in flour enough to make a paste to roll out. So not really your typical pie dough, and there are lots of atypical recipes in this little book, including one for artificial oysters, which are made with green corn, and one that always kind of makes me laugh whenever I see it. It is a recipe for nice buns. Anyway, for your potato crust, what you'll need is 6 russet potatoes, 1½ teaspoons of salt, 1 tablespoon of butter, 2 tablespoons of water, and about a cup or 120 grams of flour. So first, peel the potatoes and cut them into quarters or eighths, and then set them in a large pot with water enough to cover them and bring the pot to a boil. Boil gently for about 20 minutes or until they're very soft. Then drain the potatoes and return them to the pot and mash them up as smooth as you can. Now while they're still hot, you can add the salt, the butter, and the water and mix. Then start adding flour just a little at a time, mixing until the potatoes come together to form something like a dough. This is not going to be a roll out kind of dough. It just isn't. If you make it and you can figure out how to make it like a rollable dough, let me know, because I was unable. Instead, I just kind of took the potato mixture and mashed it into the bottom and the sides of a pie pan, and it is firm enough that you can kind of make a nice crimping on top. Then pour in your fake apple pie filling, level it off, and set it in the oven at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius for 15 minutes, and then reduce the heat to about 350, 175 Celsius, and bake for another 15 to 20 minutes. After about 20 minutes, mine started to crack on the top, which I think means it's done. Not entirely sure, but that's when I took it out, and I did leave it to cool completely. And while your pie cools, you can thank your lucky stars, I know I did, that I was able to find that mention of prisoners getting pie, because you would not want to be eating what most prisoners during the Civil War were eating. Following the first major battle of the American Civil War, the First Battle of Bull Run, both Union and Confederate troops were taken prisoner by the opposing side and sent to prisons. At this time, these prisons tended to be well built with the infrastructure to handle and care for the inmates. Food at the time was also relatively good, because should you be entering prison with a bit of money in your pocket, then they usually had a setup where you could buy things like sugar and fresh vegetables and sometimes coffee and tobacco and just other things that you might want. Generally, enlisted men had 2 full meals a day and officers had 3 full meals a day. And those meals weren't extravagant, but they were hearty, usually some sort of bean or vegetable soup, and then a bit of meat, usually salted meat, but sometimes fresh meat, that had apple cider vinegar or other vinegar put on top of it to help prevent scurvy. At Fort Warren in Boston, prisoners received fresh beef with potatoes 3 times a week, salt beef, pork, and ham 3 times a week, and baked beans on Sundays. And this was in addition to tea, coffee, and over a pound of bread every day. The food we received at Johnson's Island was not, except at times, such as a prisoner had a right to complain of. Then, too, we were allowed to receive boxes of provisions under reasonable restrictions from our friends, and we received many such contributions. But should you not have any friends to send you these care packages or any money to buy extra food, your opinion of the cuisine might be a little bit different. For example, at that same exact prison, Johnson's Island on Lake Erie, another prisoner described the food, saying bread made of inferior flour, which was occasionally sour, was issued. The meat was rusty bacon or beef neck. Occasionally we had a few worm-eaten peas, and twice I saw some small potatoes. Rats were caught in and about the sinks and sold freely. The slop barrels were raked and bread crusts were fished out to be dried in the sun and eaten. Most of the accounts of decent food in the prisons came from early on in the war, and that's for a few reasons. One was that the food shortages hadn't really hit yet, and when they did hit, it was most definitely in the South first, and they had it the hardest. Another reason was that at the beginning of the war, there were just less prisoners, and as the war went on, the prisons began to fill up. In the first couple of years of fighting, there were actually periodic prisoner exchanges to keep down the prison population, and in July 1862, an agreement was signed that made it so prisoners on both sides would only be held for a few days before being paroled back to their own lines. But by midsummer of 1863, the whole thing had kind of broken down and the exchanges stopped happening as often. Now this of course led to the prisons becoming incredibly overcrowded, and this is when, instead of proper prisons meant to take care of people, both North and South built a number of what were essentially fenced-in tent cities. Two of the most infamous were New York's Elmira prison, nicknamed Helmira, and Georgia's Camp Sumter, better known as Andersonville. At Elmira prison, they opened before they were truly ready, and within a month of opening, they had over 12,000 prisoners, even though it was built to only house 4,000. Many slept outside with no blankets, and in some accounts, no clothing at all. This, of course, became a real problem when New York's winter hit. Hundreds of men froze to death. But, at least for that first winter, the food seemed to be okay. We entered the cookhouse by wards of 200 or 240 men. Soup was placed on long tables in mess pans. Bread and meat was served in the morning, bread and soup in the evening. Each man was obliged to furnish a vessel in which to carry his soup. In winter, on very cold mornings, what a sight we were, starting to the cookhouse for our food. We went in, old rags and strings and long unkept hair, dirt, cheekbones projecting, for there was very little of us except skin and bones. And as winter went on, the rations dwindled, and so eventually the Confederate prisoners were reduced to eating the rats that infested the prison. And when a rat would make an appearance, such a hurrah and such a chase and such a volley of stones. You would have thought it was our battalion of sharpshooters in a charge. Now down in Andersonville, they didn't have the New York winter to contend with, but they did have the Georgia summer, which is frankly just as bad in many ways. And instead of being 3 times capacity, the Andersonville prison was often at 8 times capacity, so men were just packed in there. Now, Andersonville is definitely the most infamous of the Civil War's prisons, and for good reason, because even at the best of times, life in there was hellacious. Our rations consisted of 10 ounces of hardtack full of worms, 2 ounces of salt beef, half a pint of beef soup, and half a pint of boiled rice. At one time, our bread ration was cut off and half a pint of mush made of spoiled cornmeal substituted. One of the men on one occasion picked 150 worms out of 3 rations of this meal. The rations were not sufficient to sustain life. And as I said, this was during the best of times. Really, the best time that you were going to have as a prisoner at Andersonville was when you first entered, because the guards would set up what they called the sutler's shop, where you could buy different goods, including different quality foods. And it was a way to give food to the new prisoners, but more so, it was a way for the guards to enrich themselves, because many of these prisoners from the North, they had greenbacks or Union money, as opposed to the Confederate money, which was all but worthless at this point. It was only going to get worse. So it was the guards' chance to get some of that quality money. Its goods were sold at incredible prices. A teaspoonful of salt, 25 cents. A small biscuit, 50 cents. Turnips, 25 cents each. Sweet potatoes, 25 cents each. And other things in proportion. The famished skeletons would stand around and look in on the good things, and consult their money, then their stomachs, and the money was turned over for the article. And just so you can get an idea of how much these things actually cost, that teaspoonful of salt that cost $0.25, well, that's about $5 in today's money. Now, life at Andersonville was truly intolerable. Most people were missing much of their clothing. Some people had no clothing. There was constant thievery and violence from the other inmates in the camp. And there was, of course, brutal violence from the Confederates who were guarding the camp. They actually set up a perimeter about 10 feet away from the stockade that surrounded the camp. They called it the deadline. And if you passed that, the guards would shoot you right then and there. Everyone was filthy, everyone had disease, and there was very, very little shelter. Most people dug out holes into the ground and just put some sticks or blankets over them. But when reading the diaries of the men who were imprisoned at Andersonville, you really get a sense that they were focused on food. Much of the misery that they went through came from a lack of food and clean water. But this lack of food was not always out of malice, but out of incompetence. See, for much of the war, the task of feeding the prisoners was part of the quartermaster department. But in February of 1864, the Congress of the Confederacy changed that responsibility over to the commissary department. But the commissary department was not ready to take on that responsibility really for like 5 weeks. And basically for that 5 weeks, no food went out. And even after that, they were playing catch up basically for the rest of the war. Now, after the war, Richard Winder, the officer in charge of feeding and sheltering everyone at the prison, claimed that there had been no disruption in rations and that the prisoners had received plenty of sweet potatoes, plus a pound of meal, a pound of potatoes, and a pound of beef or half-pound of bacon. And while that may sometimes have been true, it was definitely never the whole truth. For that, we need to look at the journals and diaries of the men who were in the prison. May 8th. Received a pound of bread today. The first we've had since we came here. 3 ounces of beef and a bucket full of rice to be divided among 90 men. How we wretches enjoyed it. The bread was made of yellow meal and somewhat resembled fruit cake, the flies taking the place of the raisins. That was Michael Doherty of the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry, and his regiment was cornered during a battle, and 127 of them went down to Confederate prisons. 122 of them died at Andersonville, and 4 of them died at other prisons, leaving Michael Doherty to be the sole survivor of the 127 men from his regiment. And he cataloged everything that was taking place in a diary. Violence from the guards, violence from other inmates, and a complete lack of food. The rice we receive is hardly fit to eat because of so much handling and measuring. The men that have old tin cups are considered lucky, while others receive theirs on pieces of boards and in bags made out of pant legs and caps. Now imagine, if you can, the men eating that rice with a relish with their dirty black fingers. So much for starvation in the sunny South. Now, not having a tin cup might seem like a bit of a bother when you're getting corn or rice, but you also had to have something to carry the liquid rations that you were getting, like molasses or vinegar, which was really the only thing that was saving you from getting scurvy. And if you didn't have a cup or anything, you were holding that stuff in your hands. And even if you got your ingredients back to where you were at, you still usually had to actually do the cooking. And it was not easy to cook at Andersonville because very, very rarely did they actually get cooked rations. April 30th. They say we are going to get cooked rations soon. I hope we do, as wood and cooking utensils are scarce. We cook cakes on boards and lay them out in the sun until the water dries out of them. May 1st. Sunday rations. Cornmeal, rice, and molasses. Fights all the time, day and night. May 2nd. Pint of cooked rice and a gill of molasses for the next 24 hours. By that summer, the state of their rations had really gone to pot under the Georgia sun. Their meat was basically always rotten. As John L. Ransom recalled, the ham given us today was rotten, with those nameless little white things crawling around through it. And their cornmeal was very often nothing more than corn cobs that had been ground up. People were constantly dying of starvation and disease and a lack of water. They only had one water source, and it was a stream that ran through the center of the camp. And it was brackish and muddy water, and it was filthy because everything took place in that one stream. That's where people were bathing, that's where people went to the bathroom, and that's where people were getting their drinking water. So it's easy to see how Andersonville became the most infamous of the Civil War prisons. There were a lot of prisons that were terrible, but Andersonville usually gets pride of place. And part of that is because that was the one that was most publicized following the war. And it's also one of the only prisons where the people in charge, or one of the people in charge, was actually punished. It was the Commandant Henry Wirtz who was hanged in 1865. But no matter where you were, north or south, life as a POW during the American Civil War was absolutely hell. And that is why I am sure glad I was able to find that mention of making pie rather than making rations that would probably make me sick. Anyway, let's try that mock apple pie. And here we are, apple pie without apples from the American Civil War. So what's cool is that while this was baking, it actually smelled like an apple pie was baking in this house, which is so weird. So I sliced into it. As you can see, it holds together. It had to cool, but it holds together. The crust actually kind of puffed up, the potato crust. So, and it does look cooked through. Here we go. Wow. Okay. The texture is not that of apple pie. It's more like pumpkin pie, or, because it's like mashed up. But by golly, if it doesn't taste like apple pie, that's kind of weird. I mean, it's not exactly like apple pie, but almost. It's got to be that tartaric acid. I mean, that's the only ingredient in there that I can see. I don't know, that's kind of magical. Now I want to make the one that the Ritz company put out during the Depression, because I bet it's even better with Ritz crackers in there. Kind of adds that buttery flavor. And that's mighty, mighty good. So thank you again for getting the channel to 2.5 million subscribers. Thanks for watching me every Tuesday, or whenever you do tune in. How old am I? Tuning in. Anyway, I'll see you next time on Tasting History. I'm eating more of this pie. It's actually really, really good. That's so weird. Alcatraz, one of history's most notorious prisons, housing criminals like Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly, was also infamous for its food. Yes, as heinous as the reputation for the prison was, at least dinner on the Rock was something the inmates could look forward to. So thank you to Bright Cellars for sponsoring this video as we recreate a dinner on Alcatraz, this time on Tasting History. So there are several menus from Alcatraz from the 1940s and 50s, and when I looked at them, I saw something I didn't really expect, and that's that the inmates ate pretty well. For example, in 1946, in September, on one random Monday dinner, which was actually the midday meal, they had split pea soup, roast shoulder of pork, sage dressing, brown gravy, mashed potatoes, stewed corn, apple pie, and bread and coffee with milk. Not bad. And the food was supposed to be pretty good because not only was it for the inmates, but the guards ate it as well. Now, there are no recipes from the kitchens at the time, but as it happens, in 1952, the Alcatraz Women's Club, which were the wives and families of the guards and other people living on the island, they put together a cookbook of dishes that were served there. So using those recipes, I'm going to make a full meal fit for an inmate, albeit a smaller meal than that random Monday dinner. I'll make Mrs. Viola Delmore's stuffed pork chops, Mrs. Mildred Keppel's cucumber salad, and Mrs. Ruth Langley's quickie apple pie. So for the pork chops, she says cut pockets in chops and fill with mixture of half cup breadcrumbs, half cup chopped apple, and 1 teaspoon minced onion. Season with salt, pepper, and sage. Fasten with picks. Bake in moderate oven 350 degrees about 1 hour. Now you want fairly thick pork chops, at least an inch, so you can slice a deep pocket in the chop almost enough to slice it in two. Then in a bowl, add your half cup of dried breadcrumbs and a half cup of finely chopped apple and 1 teaspoon of minced onion and some chopped sage. Plus about a quarter teaspoon of salt and a teaspoon of pepper. Mix all of that together and then stuff it into the pork chops. And the finer your ingredients are, the easier it will be to stuff your chops. Then fasten them shut with toothpicks, set them on a lined baking sheet, and put them in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius. Now, Mrs. Viola Delmore says to bake these for 1 hour, and I can tell you, that is way too long. You're gonna have some dry chops. I would say almost about half that time, like 30, maybe 35 minutes, should do you pretty good. Now, while you sip your wine and your pork chops bake, you can get started on your cucumber salad. Good to have a little bit of vegetables with your dinner, especially if you don't get a lot of exercise time in the yard. So for Mrs. Mildred Keppel's cucumber salad, she says to whip evaporated milk until stiff, add vinegar and sugar to make a sweet sour dressing, add a dash of paprika and salt, pour over sliced cucumbers and onions. So I took a can of evaporated milk and I whipped it for a long time, like 20 or 25 minutes, and I had expected it to get to the consistency of like whipped cream, and it did not. It frothed up and it did get thicker, but not really like whipped cream like I expected. But then she does say that you're supposed to pour it, so I guess I shouldn't be that surprised. I also wish that she was a little more specific with exactly how much vinegar and sugar you're supposed to use to make this sweet sour dressing. I started with a teaspoon of vinegar and then I added a tablespoon of sugar, but you might want to taste as you kind of go along because I ended up adding a little bit more of each of those to get a sweet sour dressing. Then add in about a quarter teaspoon of paprika and a quarter teaspoon of salt. Mix all of this together and set it aside. Then slice up a couple of cucumbers and an onion, then mix those together and pour the dressing over them and toss it until it is coated. So that is 2 of the 3 dishes we're going to make, and the last one is a quickie apple pie, and it really is a quickie. But before we get to dessert, I wanted to share with you the most funny, if that's the word for it, recipe in the book. The thing is, it's not really funny like ha ha, it's more funny like heh heh. It's Mrs. Robert Murphy's recipe for well-bred children. Take 1 large grassy field, a half-dozen children, 2 or 3 small dogs, and a pinch of brook and some pebbles. Mix the children and dogs together and put them in a field. Stirring constantly, pour the brook over the pebbles, sprinkle the field with flowers. Spread over all a deep blue sky and bake in the sun. When brown, set to cool in a bathtub. What even is that? Are you okay, Mrs. Robert Murphy? Maybe living on a prison island just isn't really good for one's psyche. And she was the wife of a guard. Just imagine the effect that it had if you were an inmate. The island of Alcatraz, once the site of a military prison, became a federal penitentiary in 1934, and by 1937 had earned the nickname Uncle Sam's Devil's Island. And being an island, it was rather small for a federal penitentiary, only being able to hold 336 prisoners, and typically only housed about 275. But they were 275 of the most notorious and dangerous criminals in the country, like Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and the Birdman of Alcatraz, who ironically was not allowed to have birds while at Alcatraz. But most of the prisoners were really not famous. They were there because they were extremely violent and very often rule breakers that weren't able to live in the other prisons without trying to escape. It was notoriously difficult to escape from Alcatraz. The facility was maximum security, minimum privilege, but food was not considered a privilege. As an inmate on Alcatraz, you had 4 rights: medical care, clothing, shelter, and food. And of those 4, the food had the best reputation. This was in a large part due to the prison's first warden, James Saltwater Johnston. Saltwater because he was as salty as the water that surrounded the island. He set some of the rigid rules that gave the prison its reputation for the next 3 decades. For the first 4 years, he employed a rigid rule of silence, which prohibited inmates from speaking in the cell blocks, at work, and even in the mess hall. But the warden wasn't all for punishment just for punishment's sake. Rather, he was all for punishment as a way to keep order. And that's why he wanted good food, because he felt that bad food led to disorder, led to prison riots. So if there was good food, there'd be order. And not only was the food good, but he allowed the inmates to have as much as they wanted. But you had to eat what you took. We fed the inmates cafeteria style. They'd go in and put their food on a tray. You have to eat what you take. If you leave any, you don't eat the next meal. Then you go and sit 10 to a table, 5 facing 5. They had about 20 minutes to eat. A guard stood at the end of every table. The reason for the watchful eye was because the mess hall could be one of the most dangerous places in the prison. First of all, it was one of the few times when all of the inmates were gathered together and they had access to spoons, forks, and knives for eating. And at the end of the meal, they had to take all their silverware and put them in precise places on their tray so that the guard could count them, make sure nothing was missing. Even so, the mess hall every year was the scene of several small riots. Tables would be flipped and silverware, along with hot coffee, would be used as weapons against the other inmates and against the guards present. But there were ways of quickly putting down a mess hall riot. First of all, the mess hall was sometimes referred to as the gas chamber because there were 14 canisters of tear gas in the ceiling that could go off with a remote control. But that usually didn't happen. They didn't need to take that kind of action because most of the guards outside of the hall were carrying Tommy submachine guns, and so a few little rat-a-tat-tats and, order was restored. But most days, no rioting took place at all. And when the inmates got up, the guard counted the silverware, a knife, fork, and spoon for every man, and then they all went out. The officers ate the same food. So as strict as the setup was, the food was pretty good. In fact, it was often considered the best in the entire U.S. prison system at the time. One former inmate recalled, "The food at Alcatraz was as good as you would get in a good restaurant that specialized in home-cooked meals. Better than most." And so what were some of these restaurant-worthy meals? Well, breakfast included things like applesauce, fresh oranges, shredded wheat, and hot griddle cakes with honey. Dinner always came with a soup like split pea, potato chowder, or minestrone, then had an entree of meatloaf, corned beef, or breaded rock cod, along with sides like coleslaw, fresh green beans, or corn on the cob. Then supper in the evening would see the same soup from dinner along with another entree like meat croquettes with bechamel, spaghetti with meat sauce, or jambalaya. Then a dessert like cupcakes or even apricot pie. I gotta say, I was pretty shocked at the variety, and it seems that the food needed to be presented in a pleasing looking manner. And then later on, starting around the 1950s, the menu actually had to be worded in a way that made the food enticing. The June peas was an excellent choice, and this trick of menu making should be exploited as much as possible when certain foods are in season. Other words that come to mind are baby, young, milk-fed, spring, new, fresh, native, various colors such as mashed yellow turnips, cold such as chilled tomato juice, old-fashioned, homemade, etc. The title of a dish can do much in creating anticipation. That was the supervisor of culinary operations at the prison. Though all of this, the good food and the pleasing descriptions, was only if you behaved, if you followed the rules, because should you break the rules and find yourself in solitary confinement, then you could expect to get for breakfast a half bowl of milk and cereal, a half bowl of soup with 4 slices of bread for dinner, and the same for supper. Though on Thanksgiving, even those in solitary got a full Thanksgiving dinner, pumpkin pie included. Now, while that may seem a small amount of food, it was actually a lot better than most of the prisons at the time. Because, yes, it was a meager ration, but you still got 3 meals a day in solitary, where a lot of other prisons were giving 2 or even 1 a day to some prisoners. At Alcatraz, there was actually a concerted effort to stop corporal punishment, including restricting someone's food. So rather than harming the body through lashings or cold hoses and stuff like that, they sought to damage the will and the spirit of the inmates, which I guess was an improvement. But it led to many of the inmates describing Alcatraz as the toughest, hardest place in the world. The mausoleum of the living dead, lifeless automatons on the rock of despair. Some sources actually say that a way to break the spirit was by feeding them well. There were times when Inmates would be receiving upwards of 5,000 calories a day, and they received very, very little exercise, so they became lethargic. Nobody wants to start a prison riot after a big old mountain of mashed potatoes. That's why, rather than the prison, Alcatraz, using food as a punishment, it was the inmates who used not eating food as a way to protest against bad conditions in the prison. There were several hunger strikes on Alcatraz. Warden Johnson said of one that, "So far as I can judge, at this moment, the men seem to be making their annual bid for attention, and perhaps came to the conclusion that striking was not the way to do it, but going without food, a la Mahatma Gandhi, would be a better sort of protest." You know he didn't pronounce it Gandhi. Now, yes, the prisoners would use food as a way to protest, but if that food quality suffered, then they would protest, or rather riot, about that as well. One of the most famous incidents was in 1950, and it was called the Spaghetti Riot. Now, spaghetti was nothing new to the menu at Alcatraz, but in 1950, the quality of that spaghetti started to diminish over and over, every single week a little worse, until finally one inmate called it noodles with plum sauce. And another inmate basically said, if we see this on the menu again, we're flipping tables, we're going to start a riot. Next week, there was the spaghetti. So a riot broke out, putting the lives of the guards in the mess hall in danger. But the guards on the outside still had those Thompson submachine guns. I jammed that actuating lever back and she went click. Everybody heard it and knew what it meant. You look at that big muzzle staring down in there and it's just like staring down the mouth of a cannon. I said, "Lieutenant, blow your whistle." The inmates started to get up and walked out of the cafeteria just like lambs. Now, spaghetti riots aside, working in the kitchens was actually one of the most coveted jobs at Alcatraz. Up to 10% of the prison population worked in there at any given time. Partly, it was because when you were a cook, you got to take a daily shower, which not everyone did. Also, they tended to be treated better by the guards. First of all, they were making the food that the guards were going to eat, and second of all, they were the most trusted of inmates. They were just given a job that had knives. And early on, before the 1950s and regulations kind of tightened, they had a lot of freedom in what they were making and would even make special little dishes just for themselves, just for the kitchen crew. Former public enemy number one, Alvin Karpis, nicknamed Creepy Karpis, went to work in the kitchens in 1943, where he'd bake himself and his friends all sorts of special little pastries, and with access to yeast and fruit, would whip up batches of prison wine. He was actually written up in 1945 when he was found staggering around the yard, drunk on his own brew. But he was not the only one. Many of the inmates would take out scraps of potato peelings or little pieces of fruit and yeast and would make their own wines and other batches of who knows what in other parts of the prison. In fact, they would take little matchboxes and fill them with baker's yeast and sell them to prisoners who didn't work in the kitchen for $5 a pop. Now, there are a multitude of reasons why in 1963, after 29 years in operation, Alcatraz closed as a prison. But the number one reason was cost. It was 3 times as expensive to house an inmate at Alcatraz than pretty much any other prison, because everything on that island had to be brought over from San Francisco by boat. Every gallon of water, every bag of flour, and every apple. Like the 6 apples that you'll need to make this quickie apple pie. Now, there are a few things that Mrs. Ruth Langley cuts out to make this apple pie quickie, but the most quickie making thing of the apple pie is that there is no crust. She says to take 6 tart apples, then peel and cut them into slices, then place them in a deep pie pan and cover with cold water. Then you set that pan on the stove and bring it to a boil for about 5 minutes. While it boils, take 3/4 cup or 90 grams of flour and 1 cup or 200 grams of sugar and whisk them together. Once the apples are boiled, spread the flour and sugar over the top, pressing it down until juice comes up to cover the top, but don't mix it into the apples. I guess this is her version of a crust. Then take about 2 tablespoons of butter in little pieces and dot the top, then sprinkle that with cinnamon and pop it in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius for 15 to 20 minutes or just until the top starts to brown. And that's it. That is your 3 dishes. So add a cup of coffee or tea and a slice of bread, and you got yourself a dinner fit for an inmate at Alcatraz prison. It looks pretty good, except for the apple pie. Apple pie does not look good, but it actually smells really good. Smells like an apple pie. So maybe it's just not the prettiest of things. But I'm going to start with the pork chop. Here we go. Yeah, I overcooked that pork. Still good though, tastes good. Even 35 minutes was too long on the pork. I don't know what she's doing for an hour. Even if it was a huge pork chop, it's just way too long. But the flavor is really good. Because there's nothing particularly special about the pork chop, it's pork chop. But the stuffing is really nice. There's just a little bit of spice there from the pepper, but the sweetness of the apples is really what comes through. It tastes a lot like a stuffing, I guess, with the breadcrumbs, because with the apples giving moisture to the breadcrumbs, what went in as sort of a dry filling is now nice and stuffing-ish. It's good. Now I have to admit, I'm a little more worried about the cucumbers here with onions. Let me get an onion. But here we go. It's not bad. You get that sweet and tangy kind of sourness of the dressing. I wish I had added more paprika. I think that would just kind of liven it up. The main flavor is still the onion and the cucumber. I think the onion just kind of overpowers the cucumber. But it's nice and refreshing and would probably be a welcome thing to be eating if you spent your entire day inside of a cell. Finally, on to the part that I'm most excited about, this quickie apple pie, because it smells really, really good. It almost looks like some of the apples kind of totally disintegrate into like an applesauce, but then some of the apples are still kind of whole. And it does look kind of like a crust on top, kind of. We'll give it to Miss Langley. That's delicious. It tastes like apple pie. It tastes like just the filling though, because I guess that's kind of all it is. But I didn't think it would be quite as good as it is because you're not mixing the apples with the spices and the sugar and everything. That's all just going on top. But I guess when it's in the oven, it all kind of melts down through it and flavors everything really nicely. Nice and soft. That's good. It's like apple pie pudding. So if ever I was in Alcatraz, that apple pie pudding, quickie apple pie, that would be something I would definitely go back for, and I would clean my plate for that. Everything else about Alcatraz kind of sounds horrible, but that's good. So I mean, nothing here is like, oh, you gotta go make this, but it is cool to eat foods that they would have eaten, you know, in the world's most notorious prison, or one of them. But if you are in need of an apple pie and don't want to make an apple pie, make this quickie apple pie. It's actually quite worth it. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. Thanks to Johnny Cash, Folsom Prison is one of the most famous penitentiaries in the world. And when he performed there in 1968, he did so in the dining room. Now, I'm not sure what the men that day were eating, but a menu from 43 years earlier shows that the prisoners had a dinner of lamb curry and rice, which I'll be making today using a recipe from the period. So thank you to Cometeer and their delicious coffee for sponsoring this video as we eat like the convicts of Folsom Prison. This time on Tasting History. So last month, someone on the Tasting History Reddit page posted this menu from Folsom Prison for a week's meals from 1925. And a lot of people were like, well, you should make this into an episode, so here I am. As I started to scan the menu, I saw that breakfast usually meant hamburger steak with gravy, stewed peaches, or some sort of oatmeal mush. And then supper, which was the meal before bed, they usually had split pea soup, macaroni vegetable soup, or tapioca. But dinner, which was served in the mid-afternoon, is where the more interesting dishes reside. Things like corned beef hash, baked spaghetti, codfish with potatoes and cream. But what I thought was the most interesting, at least from this period in time, was lamb curry with rice. Unfortunately, it does seem that no recipes from the prison from this period in time actually exist today, but I reached out to the person who first posted it on Reddit, and it turns out that he actually has recently worked at Folsom Prison, both as a cook and then later a food manager. And he said that at this time, in the 1920s, a lot of the cooks were using military manuals for their recipes. So I turned to the 1916 edition of the Manual for Army Cooks. And while there wasn't a lamb curry recipe, there was one for beef curry for 60 men. Ingredients used: 20 pounds beef, 1.5 ounces curry powder. Cut the beef into 1-inch cubes and place in a bake pan. Cover with beef stock or water, season with salt, pepper, and curry powder. When nearly done, thicken slightly with a flour batter. Serve hot. In addition to this extremely basic recipe, I found a commissary report from 1933 from Folsom Prison, and while it is extremely difficult to read, I could make out that they were still serving lamb curry and rice, which, in addition to mutton, rice, and curry, also required onions and carrots. So with both the Army Manual and the commissary report to inform this recipe, what you'll need is 2 pounds or 1 kilogram of lamb or mutton. Obviously, I am not going to be making enough for 60 men. I don't even think I know 60 people, so I'm cutting this whole dish way back. A half teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of pepper, 2 teaspoons or 4.2 grams curry powder. Now there are lots of types of curry powder, and I'm not exactly sure what they were using in the prison, but the Army Manual describes curry powder as a yellow powder formed by a mixture of numerous hot peppers and ginger, used in high seasoning for stews, etc. So if you can find one that has a yellow hue and includes ginger, that's the one to use. Then 1 medium onion, 2 carrots, 1 quart or 1 liter of beef stock or water, then a 1/4 cup or 30 grams of flour. Then all that'll be served with some white rice. Also, the menu includes 2 side dishes that were served with pretty much every meal, and that is brown beans and white bread. Then they were given either tea to drink or coffee, though usually it was chicory coffee, or at least partly chicory coffee. First, the recipe says to chop the meat into 1-inch cubes, then put all of those cubes into a baking dish. Then chop up the onion and the carrots into pretty small pieces, and then scatter this all over the meat. Then sprinkle the salt and the pepper over everything, along with the curry powder. Then pour the beef stock or water over everything and give it all a stir. And if you're using water, you'll probably need to add a little bit more salt, maybe a teaspoon more. Then set this in the oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 120 Celsius for 2 hours, and then remove it from the oven and ladle about half a cup of the juice into a bowl, and then add the flour in and whisk it all to make a slurry. Once the flour is well dissolved, add that back into the dish, stir it in, and then set it back into the oven for another hour. And if all that you want to make is the curry, then bully for you, you're pretty much done. But if you want to make the rest of the meal, then you're going to need to make some brown beans, that is, pinto beans. And another recipe from one of those old Army manuals describes it, and it's really basic. It's really just beans. So take a cup of pinto beans and soak them for a few hours, then add them into a small pot with 3 cups or 700 milliliters of water and a pinch of salt. Then bring the pot to a gentle boil, reduce to a simmer, and set the lid on and simmer for 60 to 90 minutes or until pretty much all of the liquid is gone. Now this meal is really simple, but it sounds delicious, along with most of the other things that are on the menu. But that's from 1925, and it turns out that was not always the case for food at Folsom Prison. Learning about the food from Folsom Prison in the early days of its existence was kind of tough because, on the one hand, a lot of the information that we have comes from the newspapers at the time, and I'm guessing the reporters were pretty well regulated and the warden was only going to let them write about the more positive aspects of the prison. On the other hand, the cruelty and depravity of things that took place in the prison became so mythologized that it's almost hard to even know if it's true. It was so infamous that the 1951 movie Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison starts out with the prison itself telling the audience what it was like, with lines like,
"Every morning while it was still dark, My guards made the rounds, turning out the inmate kitchen workers so they could cook the slop that was fed my prisoners under the name of breakfast.
So things like this make it hard to discern what was fact and what was fiction, and maybe we just have to kind of accept that as we look at the history of the prison. Now, Folsom Prison was essentially an overflow prison for the overcrowded San Quentin. The location of the new prison, about 45 miles northeast of California's capital city of Sacramento, was chosen in 1868, but it didn't actually open until 1880, when, on July 26th, 44 prisoners were transferred from San Quentin. In these early days, the prison had no heating and no plumbing, and the prisoners spent pretty much their entire day inside of small, dark 4 by 8 foot cells that were closed with a solid iron door. It didn't let in much light. Perhaps what makes this prison kind of unique is that for a long time there were 2 cell blocks where the inmates stayed, but there were no walls around the actual prison. Instead, they relied on a series of guard towers with armed guards to watch the area if the prisoners got out, and they did. One of the most infamous escapes took place in 1903 when 13 prisoners stole weapons from the armory and escaped because there were no walls. And some of them were recaptured, but 5 of them never were. The need for a wall should be obvious. It has been urged since the prison was established, and if any demonstration were needed, it was furnished by last year's disastrous break when several escaped. It still took a few years after that to get the walls started, and they weren't completed until 1923, almost 2 decades later. Now, Folsom was known for a few things back in the day. One was that it was the first prison in the US to have electricity, and this was because it was built right on a river that had a hydroelectric dam. This also gave them an opportunity to have access to ice all year round because with the electricity, they produced a lot of ice for the farmers in the Central Valley of California and had California's fruit being sent all over the country on ice. But did that ice ever make it into the glasses of the prisoners? Well, maybe on occasion, at least for holidays. See, in 1889, the Folsom Telegraph wrote about the 4th of July celebrations amongst the prisoners. A program consisting of music and literary features was carried out by them, and a large quantity of lemonade was made and partaken of by them. I suppose the lemonade could have been uniced, but I'd like to think that it was served cold, seeing as Central California can get mighty hot during the summer. Now, in that same edition of the newspaper, the first warden, Charles All, printed his annual report where he boasted about the food and other aspects of the prison in a rather macabre manner, saying 6 deaths have occurred at the prison during the fiscal year, or about 1% of our population. The showing is most a flattering tribute to the sanitary condition of the prison, the food, and the care of the convicts. Some 10 acres have been planted to garden in potatoes, onions, tomatoes, cabbage, corn, etc. The garden has furnished all of the potatoes for the prison for a month past, and there will be enough for 6 weeks or 2 months longer. With producing all the hay needed, curing our own bacon, pork, and ham, and supplying all our needs for vegetables, fruit, and grapes, the expense bill will be materially reduced in the future. All was actually instrumental in bringing the prison into the modern age, because before him, the prison menu consisted mainly of mush, beans, and bread, and occasionally dried fruit of some kind, never any fresh fruit. The prison also served a dish that was served at most prisons of the day, and that was skilly, and that's basically oats and water, like oatmeal, except much, much waterier, more like gruel, but also the water was used to soak salt pork, so it was really salty gruel. But the warden changed that as he got the farms and the orchards at the prison up and running so that both the prisoners and the guards could have a much improved diet. He was also interested in just making the prison better in general. Like after another prison escape in 1893, he suggested that they put up walls. Didn't happen for quite some time, but at least he suggested it. He also curbed the excessive use of the dungeon, which is what they called the 13 pitch-black cells of solitary confinement. Now, he didn't get rid of them, but he did make it so prisoners wouldn't be in there for weeks or even months at a time. One prisoner spent 18 months straight in the dungeon in pitch black. It was pretty horrible. Now, while improved, it still wasn't exactly the Four Seasons, as one prisoner who wrote in 1926 said the dungeon was an empty cell with a solid door to darken it and contained nothing but a thin blanket and a bucket strong with chloride of lime. In cases of this kind, the captain signed the punishment order, which included bread and water. Every third day, the prisoner got a pan of beans. Most of them were so hungry they bolted the beans without stopping to chew them, and a few dungeon sentences brought on stomach troubles that added to their misery. Bread and water, and occasionally beans. That's what you got in the dungeon, and it is knowing that that experience existed that makes me question some of the validity of the early newspaper articles which touted the creature comforts of Folsom Prison. A comfortable prison. No solitary confinement, skilly diet, plank bed, or unyielding and stern discipline are to be found there. A new prisoner is allowed 3 good meals a day, which he partakes of at what is called the first table. In a few days, the prisoner makes 2 discoveries. First, that some of his companions go out into the open air, and second, that they have much better food than is provided for him at the first table. By working satisfactorily, he is allowed to partake of the better fare of the second table. When it is seen that the prisoner is trying his best to please, he is promoted to the third table, where really luxurious living is provided, consisting of mutton chops, beefsteak with potatoes and bread and hot rolls and coffee every morning. For dinner, the menu is roast beef or mutton, barley soup, macaroni, vegetables, and pudding. They even indulge the convicts in supper, at which hash, stewed apples, and prunes figure. Now, I tried to find some better descriptions of this first, second, and third table setup, but I had trouble, and the things that I did find were not exactly well documented from back in the day. But it seems that at the first table, all you got was beans, and the tin plate was actually nailed to the table, and you didn't get any cutlery because all that could be used as a weapon, I guess. So you had to eat with your hands, or I guess, like a pig at a slop trough. But then you got to the second table, and the food definitely improved. Though at both the first and the second table, I guess you had to eat in perfect silence. You only got to start talking at the third table. This seems to be the kind of food that we can see on the menu that we're working from today. This table was often reserved for the convict straw bosses, or con bosses, who were prisoners that were trusted to be put in charge of other prisoners. Food from this table was also used to reward stool pigeons. One account said that the captain of the guard, a man named Murphy, gave the best snitches the biggest beefsteaks. Now, the other way to get some quality food was to pay for it, basically to bribe the guards to bring it in for you, so you could get extra sugar and butter and even alcohol and other things to brighten up your meal. But I wondered how the convicts were getting a hold of money to pay the guards, and it turns out that at least in 1890, they were just making it themselves. On March 11, 1898, Secret Service agents entered the blacksmith shop at the prison and found a number of prisoners, led by an experienced counterfeiter, creating coins which they'd been using to buy drugs, alcohol, and, I guess, sugar. The coins became known as the Folsom nickel, and it was a major embarrassment for the prison. Now, if you couldn't afford to bribe the guards, if you didn't want to be a snitch, because snitches get stitches, and if you just didn't have the personal leadership skills in order to be put in charge of other prisoners, there was one other way that you could get access to some good food, and that was wait for the holidays. Christmas 1923 featured macaroni salad, fresh roast pork and dressing, sweet potatoes, stewed tomatoes, oranges, apples, apple pie, cheese, ginger cookies, and coffee with milk and sugar. There was a picture show in the new auditorium, and the picture The Spoilers was viewed by an appreciative audience. Similarly, the 4th of July often included a breakfast of real pork sausage and gravy and other wonderful foods, but really, it was Thanksgiving that you wanted to look forward to the most because in addition to a right feast, you got to play some baseball. Thanksgiving was an enjoyable day for the prisoners in the Folsom Penitentiary. There was a ball game in the morning between Hale Brothers' Winter League team and the prison team. The ball game was followed by a picture show in the auditorium. The menu for the prisoners' Thanksgiving dinner included roast beef with browned potatoes, macaroni salad, apricot pie, cakes, coffee, and milk. The officers and guards were served a fine turkey dinner. But there was one Thanksgiving that was perhaps less than festive, and that was in 1927 when, due to the altered schedule, the prisoners took advantage of that and started a riot. It was a deadly riot, and they called in tanks and 400 National Guardsmen, and instead of being used as a place to eat, the dining room was used as a machine gun nest. The dining room where food is stored abuts on the front end of the old cell block. A machine gun was trained on the door which leads from the block to the dining room passageway. Had a dash for food been made, prisoners would have been met by the death-dealing gunfire. Though even through all this mayhem, the warden's wife and daughter continued to cook so they could provide the National Guardsmen with a good Thanksgiving dinner, while her husband was trapped inside the prison. The mess kitchen was set up in the warden's home, and Mrs. Smith and her 22-year-old daughter doffed their holiday attire and aided in preparing chow for the boys. By most accounts, prison riots aside, the food at the prison continued to improve over the years, partly because the farm kept growing, the prison farm. By the 1920s, they had a dairy farm, they had over 100 pigs, and they also had a chicken ranch and enough orchards to produce so much fruit that aside from just having fresh fruit, they were able to can 18,000 gallon cans of fruit each year to be used in the prison by both the convicts and the guards. Though I guess this improvement in food wasn't constant because there were occasional complaints about the quality of the food by both the prisoners and the guards alike. And then in 1968, Johnny Cash, partly in jest, questioned the quality of a cup of water that he received when he was on the stage in the prison dining room performing his 1955 hit Folsom Prison Blues. As for me, I have a water filter on my sink, so I know that it's safe to drink as I drink some water alongside this dinner from 1925 from Folsom Prison. So once the curry is ready, take it out of the oven and dish it up onto some rice, and then serve that with the pinto beans and a couple slices of white bread. And here we are, a 1925 lamb curry dinner as it was served in one of America's most notorious prisons. Let's give this a try. I'm just going to try some of the meat first, just to get the flavor. A little rice, I guess. It's actually quite good. It smells like curry. The taste of curry is there, but it really could be stronger. Honestly, if I was making this, I'd probably add like twice as much curry. But I followed the exact, because it gives you an exact weight of how much curry powder to add. So that's how much I added. I'd want more curry, but it doesn't taste bad. Tastes pretty good. Plenty of salt, I think. The vegetables, let's try some of that. Same. As for the beans, it's literally just beans, water, and a pinch of salt, so I don't expect much. Tastes like beans. I gotta say, the meal, it's not terrible. It's nothing to write home about. I would think it'd get pretty monotonous, because if you look at the menu from 1925 and then you look at the commissary report from 1933, not a lot changed. So, you know, a lot of the same people that were there in 25 were still there in 33. So that's, you know, that's just how it was. I guess it's to be expected. That said, it was fun to learn about Folsom Prison and the history and the food. So if there are any more menus out there that you think might be cool to recreate something from and find a little history behind, do share. Reddit is one of the best places, r/tasting history. Thank you so much for sharing that menu with me, and thanks for watching me make this, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. During World War II, most every country involved, Axis or Allies, faced some sort of food rationing for its citizens on the home front. And this led to the advent of numerous interesting dishes, like this American recipe for emergency steak made with ground meat, milk, and Wheaties cereal. So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we examine the American home front during World War II, this time on Tasting History. So this is going to be the first in a series of videos that I release over the next few months about the home front during World War II for various countries, and not just the Allied powers like the US, the UK, the Soviet Union, but also the Axis powers like Japan and Germany. But since I am from the US, I figured I would start at home and have the first video be from America's point of view, even though we were kind of Johnny-come-latelys when it came to World War II. We didn't even enter the war until a few years after it started, and even then we didn't start rationing food until mid-1942. It was in May of 1942 that the first ration card was distributed to all Americans, and this was focused on rationing sugar. This was followed by coffee rationing later that year, which led people to brew Roosevelt coffee, which was just weak coffee made from reused grounds. And then came the rationing of meat, dairy, cooking oils, and a whole host of canned and processed foods. And as ingredients became more and more difficult to find, publishers put out recipes designed to make rationing more bearable. And one of the most iconic of these books was Betty Crocker's Your Share: How to Prepare Appetizing, Healthful Meals with Foods Available Today. The book, published in 1943, starts off with a section on stretching meat and cautions consumers to watch your P's and Q's, points and quantities. The points being a method of buying food. Different foods required different ration points, and we'll talk more about it later, but you had to spend these points in addition to spending money to get food. So it was all about conserving your points. The cookbook gives an example of 1 pound of ground meat, which serves 4 or 5 people and costs 7 points, while the same weight of a porterhouse steak, which could only serve 2 or 3 people, would cost 12 points. So if you're running low on points, but you have a hankering for a steak, you're kind of out of luck unless you follow Betty Crocker's recipe for emergency steak. It calls for 1 pound of ground beef or hamburger, a half cup of milk, 1 cup Wheaties, 1 teaspoon salt, 1/2 teaspoon pepper, 1 tablespoon chopped onion. Place on pan, pat into T-bone steak shape 1 inch thick, broil 8 to 15 minutes at 500 degrees, very hot. Turn once. Now I have yet to try this emergency steak, and I kind of think that it's not going to actually taste like a real steak, but at least it only costs 7 ration points instead of 12, which a regular steak would cost. Now personally, one of my favorite breakfast items, just in general, is cereal, which oddly enough is an ingredient in this recipe for steak. Specifically, it calls for Wheaties cereal. And the reason is because Wheaties was owned by General Mills. And most of the recipes in this book use different products from General Mills because, as we've covered in a previous episode, Betty Crocker was basically just a character that was created to sell the products of General Mills, or originally the Washburn-Crosby Company. The thing is, since Wheaties are a flaked cereal, I'm thinking that just sticking them into this meat combo, it will lead to a very jagged steak. So I'm assuming that they are being used as a binder of some sort, so I'm going to go ahead and crush them up. Not super fine, but fairly fine. And then I don't think it really matters the order that you mix the ingredients, but the way that I did it was I took the pepper and salt and added it to the meat, and then I added the chopped onion and mixed all of that in, and then added the Wheaties. Once everything was combined, I added the milk, and it took a minute or so of mixing, but eventually everything came together. And then, once everything is together, you come to the hard part, and that is sculpting this meat into the shape of a T-bone steak. So put the meat onto a baking sheet lined with foil. And you don't have to use aluminum foil. They wouldn't have used foil at that time because aluminum was scarce, and there's a war on, don't you know? But I'm using foil because it's going to make it a lot easier later on. Then start to mold the meat into the shape of a T-bone steak. I think I got pretty close, though I kind of wish I had like a real T-bone steak nearby to use as a model, but I think I did fine. What is most important is that you don't make it much thicker than 1 inch. He says 1 inch, because if it is much thicker, then the ground meat on the inside is not going to cook all the way, and that would be bad. But once your T-bone steak is ready, set it in the oven under the broiler at 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 Celsius, and let it broil for about 8 minutes. Then remove it from the oven and flip it. The issue here is this is not a real steak, so if you try to flip it like with a flipper of some sort or tongs, it will disintegrate. So The best way that I found to do it was to take another pan that was clean with foil, set it on top, and then flip both of them together, wearing gloves, flip both of them together, and then you flipped your steak. Then put that steak back under the broiler for another 8 minutes or so, or until the internal temperature reaches 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, as we finish browning our emergency steak in the oven, let's take a closer look at what rationing in the US was like during World War II. On December 7, 1941, the Empire of Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan, and Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The US was now officially part of a conflict that had been raging in Europe for over 2 years and in Asia for over 4. And almost immediately, the Office of Price Administration, which had been established only months before the attack, set in to rationing certain items to the American public. Just a few days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the sale of tires was cut off. At that time, 75% of all the rubber in the US was used to make car tires. But as a single battleship required over 75 tons of rubber, this meant tires on the home front were a luxury the US could no longer afford. You were actually encouraged/ordered to save your 5 best tires and sell others to Uncle Sam. But should you really need a tire, you could get one, but you had to apply and go through a long process just to be able to possibly purchase one. So it was all about conserving the tires that you did have. And this led to something known as the victory speed, or war speed, which was basically a national speed limit of 35 miles an hour, which reduced wear and tear on the tires. Shortly after the tires became rationed, so too did bicycles and automobiles altogether. Any company that had been making these items instead turned to making military vehicles and munitions. Gasoline too was being rationed, and people were encouraged to join car-sharing clubs, basically carpools. One government poster from the time encouraged you to join one because when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. And these weren't really optional restrictions. Today, if you are caught speeding, you'll get a ticket. But then, if you're caught speeding, you could have your gasoline ration taken away entirely, so you can't drive at all. What's interesting is that the gasoline and other fuels like coal, while very important for the war effort, were not as precious as some other items because America produced plenty of oil and coal, so they could always just make more. But there were other commodities that were not produced at home, and so they were severely rationed. Things like rubber. Most of the rubber at the time came from Southeast Asia, and as soon as the war set in, the Japanese cut off that supply completely. Another ingredient that was like that was sugar, and that's why it was the first to be rationed, because most of the sugar that the US was eating came from the Philippines. And so the only sugar that was grown at home was from places like Hawaii and Puerto Rico, and that was nowhere near enough to satisfy the needs of American sugar eaters. But not being able to import a certain item was just one reason that something might be rationed. There were other reasons, like the supply chain. It was very taxed at the time, and things like trucks and railroads were completely overrun transporting troops and war supplies from coast to coast. In addition, those troops being transported were usually young men who had been taken out of the workforce, so there was a huge labor shortage. And very quickly, many women stepped in to take those jobs, but it wasn't immediate, and it was kind of a game of catch-up for quite some time. Then there was the issue of feeding those troops who were no longer producing food, because not only were they taking up food, but they also took up a lot of other items that were required to get the food to them in places like Europe, Africa, and Asia. Like a lot of their food was packaged in tin cans, but the US had almost no tin. And so foods like processed foods and canned goods became extremely scarce almost overnight. Stores put up signs letting people know how their stock had decreased over the year, and processed foods were often down around 80%. So to stop people from buying up all the canned goods and hoarding them, they too became rationed. Now, rationing something like sugar is very easy. You get 4.5 ounces per week. Simple as that. But rationing something like canned food is a little bit more difficult. First of all, It's all different sizes. And does a can of tomato soup equal the same as a can of green beans? What if you don't like tomato soup? It just became much more complicated. Luckily, Britain, who had been rationing for several years at this point, already had a system that the US could look at as a model, and that was the points system. Every person in the US, regardless of age, received an allotment of red and blue points. Red were used for meat, dairy, and fats, and blue were used for canned and bottled goods as well as baby food. Each week you had a certain amount of points that you could use, and you had to use those in conjunction with money to actually buy the product itself, so they also started putting price caps on pretty much every item in the country. The system was clunky and complex and confusing for many people, so the government started putting out these newsreels to kind of try to explain it, and one of my favorites has a narrator who sounds like a cartoon gangster from the 1940s, and it's funny because he even kind of admits that it's a terribly confusing system, and he says that in comparison, this makes filling out income taxes strictly for amateurs. And there were lots of people who now wish they hadn't played hooky when the teacher was giving out with addition and subtraction. But of course, if you don't figure right, you have nothing to chew on but fresh vegetables, which is hay strictly for citizens who chew their cuds, or maybe rabbits. And this is just one reason why people did not like the rationing system. But most people realized there is a war on, and I gotta do my part, and so they accepted rationing, even though they were always kind of grumbling about it. But in 1943, the government tried to explain how important it was, saying rationing is essentially democratic. It protects the little man who is unable to pay exorbitant prices for articles of which limited quantities exist. Basically, rationing was the only way to make it fair for everyone and to keep down what could be rampant inflation. There were ways, though, to kind of get around some of the rationing rules, and that was simply to eat more foods that didn't require ration points, because not everything required points. Pretty much all fresh vegetables and fruits were never rationed. The canned versions were, because those were being sent overseas, but you can't really send like a fresh zucchini to Germany. It's just not gonna last. So fresh vegetables, have as many as you want. And that kind of went for most fresh foods. Fresh milk was never rationed, though processed milk products like cheese or evaporated milk or butter, those were rationed. Though if you did ever want your cheese fix, you could eat Kraft macaroni and cheese because you could get 2 boxes for only 1 ration point. And for getting the most out of your butter, there were numerous recipes that would help you stretch what you had, like mixing butter with gelatin and milk, neither of which required ration points. One of the few fresh foods that was rationed was meat, especially beef, which was one of the most costly items both in money and in points. That's why there are so many recipes from this period for like mock meats. Like the one that we're making today, the emergency steak, is using lesser quality meats to mimic a better cut of meat. And then there were recipes that just tried to kind of replace meat altogether. Like one for baked peanuts, a meat alternative, which included peanuts, tomatoes, and molasses that was baked in a dish. This wasn't so much to mimic the taste or texture of meat, nobody was pretending that it was, but it was meant to mimic the nutritional value that you would get if you were to eat a sirloin. But even those foods that were not rationed could still be very difficult to get. Like for the entirety of the war, eggs were incredibly hard to find. So you have a lot of recipes from this period for eggless cakes. Because of all these reasons, people started raising and growing their own food at home. People would raise chickens and rabbits, especially in the city, and if you had a little bit more space, a lot of people would have goats or pigs or even cattle. And then there was the Victory Garden. Now again, this is something that the US was able to look across the pond to Britain because the British had been building victory gardens for a while, though actually both in the US and in Britain they had done this back in World War I. But World War II really saw the Victory Garden come to life. The government put out calls for everyone who had a patch of dirt or even available space on their roof to begin gardening their own fruits and vegetables at home. And by May 1943, there were 12 million victory gardens growing in America's cities and another 6 million on unused farmland. Eleanor Roosevelt even planted one on the White House lawn. Cities converted parks to be community-run victory gardens, like the lawns of Riverside Park in New York City, the Boston Common, and portions of Golden Gate Park in San Francisco. And in an era before you could just watch a YouTube video if you wanted to learn how to grow a green bean, they would put out books like the ABC of Victory Gardens to teach us city dwellers how best to turn your backyard into an instrument of war. And I say that because that is how the government sold these gardens, as an instrument of war. A victory garden is like a share in an airplane factory. It helps win the war and it pays dividends too. By 1944, victory gardens were producing about as many fruits and vegetables as the commercial farms of the country, which is pretty darn impressive. What I found interesting is that there wouldn't have actually been such a need for these victory gardens had the government not kind of shot themselves in the foot right from the get-go. See, the vast majority of certain fruits and vegetables were being grown in California, Oregon, and Washington state, and many of the farms were owned by Japanese Americans. For instance, a full half of the tomatoes and 95% of snap peas were grown just by Japanese American farms. And so when FDR signed Executive Order 9066 and sent many of those same growers to inland internment camps, over 6,100 farms were taken, but many lay fallow due to a lack of labor. But since those who had been sent to those camps knew so much about farming, the victory gardens that they set up at these Japanese internment camps turned out to be some of the most productive in the entire country. And I would actually love to do a whole video just on what they ate at these Japanese internment camps. So if that's something that you would be interested in, let me know, and I'll make it into a video. Now, while most Americans were growing their own fruits and vegetables, raising livestock, and accepting the nature of rationing with as much dignity as they could muster, there were, of course, some who thought that they were above the rules and didn't play fair, and this led to a thriving black market. This usually took the form of a consumer overpaying the monetary value of a certain product and not giving the grocer or whoever it was any ration stamps. You know, a little under the table. I'll pay you double, but no stamps. Unfortunately, the person who was taking this money had to turn in those stamps if they wanted to keep being resupplied, and so this led to counterfeit stamps, stealing different stamps, or they would have to ask other people who didn't use all of their stamps to give them theirs. And that's why the government said that any unused stamps that you have at a certain end of a period, you should destroy. Now, there was, of course, a social stigma against this. You know, why should I have to play by the rules if you're not? But since everyone kind of hated rationing, it wasn't that uncommon. They say that a full 17% of the meat that was being sold in the US at the time was being sold via the black market. And these people who were doing this were not called bootleggers like they were during Prohibition, but meatleggers. And they were put on the same plane as spies and saboteurs. There isn't any great difference. They're all helping the enemy. But I assure you, I am no meatlegger. I purchased my ground beef on the up and up. The ground beef that I am using to make my emergency steak, which should be ready to eat. And here we are, emergency steak from the World War II home front. I mean, it kind of looks like a steak, kind of, if you don't look too closely, if you squint. It's pretty cool, actually, and it smells good. Smells like meatloaf. Pretty sure it's gonna taste like meatloaf because looking back, it's kind of a lot like meatloaf. Here we go. That is pleasantly delightful. It does kind of taste like meatloaf, but a little bit different. I was thinking that it wasn't going to have a lot of flavor because there isn't a lot of spice or anything in there, but it actually has a really good amount of flavor. Maybe the Wheaties really add something. I mean, I think you could put like a sauce with it, but I don't think you really need it. It's really good as is. Emergency steak. Very nice. Now, the rationing of meat pretty much ended with the end of the war, I think shortly thereafter, and most of the rationing ended at the end of the war or shortly thereafter. But there was one ingredient that was rationed all the way until 1947, and it was the ingredient that had been the very first to be rationed, and that is sugar. So pretty crazy that it was still being rationed 2 years after the end of the war. But that is nothing in comparison with what Great Britain had to go through. They were still rationing certain ingredients, meat being one of them, until 1954, 9 years after the end of the war. So America had it pretty good in comparison. But I will touch on England or Great Britain and how they dealt with the home front and rationing and living on the home front, because they were actually part of the war. Battle of Britain, all that rot. So probably won't be the next one that I do in this series, or it might be. Maybe next month. Not sure, don't hold me to it, but make sure to keep watching and it'll pop up one of these days, and I will see you next time on Taste. During World War II, there was an 8-month period in the UK known as the Blitz, where the German Luftwaffe would drop bombs all over the cities of Britain. Nearly every night, the people of London would descend into shelters like those set up in the London Underground. The food options down there were limited, but if you were lucky, you could expect some honey biscuits and a bowl of Blitz soup. So thank you to the new film Blitz, streaming on Apple TV Plus November 22nd, for partnering with me on this video as we dine in a bomb shelter, this time on Tasting History. I recently had the good fortune to watch the new film Blitz, directed by Academy Award winner Steve McQueen. And as the title suggests, it takes place during the early days of the Blitz. From September of 1940 through May of 1941, over a dozen cities were bombed, including Coventry, Liverpool, and Birmingham, but perhaps most constant was the bombing of London. And because of this, the government set up a plan to evacuate the children from cities like London to the countryside for relative safety. And this is what happens in the movie Blitz. Saoirse Ronan's character Rita makes the decision to send her son George, played by Elliot Heffernan, to safety in the English countryside. My heart was pounding from the very opening of the film because it actually begins with the bombing of London, and it is intense, and it really doesn't let up until the end. Because while the fictional story of George and Rita trying to find each other is emotional and hopeful, it is set and surrounded by the events of one of the most terrifying periods in history. And so every night in the film, as the German planes drop bombs on London, the characters are forced into the underground shelters for safety. And this, of course, led me to ask the question, what were they eating down there? Well, in the early days, it was basically whatever you brought with you. But very soon, after just a couple weeks, an army of women had been employed to start serving food out of what were known as canteens, or else they would go around the shelters and serve snacks and tea and things like that. And in November of 1940, a reporter from the Evening Standard went down into one of these shelters and talked about what it was like. Tea, cocoa, and soup were brewing in 3 electrically heated 10-gallon boilers. Some of the 6 girl attendants were serving these, others were patrolling the shelter pitches with trays of cakes, buns, apples, chocolate, the prices clearly marked on a notice pinned to their overalls. For 6 pence I bought a bun, piece of cake, pack of biscuits, slab of chocolate. So I decided to make 2 of the dishes that would have been available for purchase, soup and biscuits. But because of wartime rationing, which I covered in a video last month, making these required some ingenuity. So I found 2 recipes from the period that could help me along. For the soup, I looked to Gert and Daisy's Wartime Cookery Book, Gert and Daisy being a popular comedy duo at the time. Their recipe is for something fittingly called Blitz soup, and while the recipe itself is very simple, I chose it because 1, the name, and 2, it comes with a little poem. When down to your shelter you flits, it may not be quite like the Ritz. If you drink something warm, you'll come to no harm, and the best soup to drink is the Blitz. P.S. Any vegetables can be used, and you'll find this a very useful soup to take to the shelter if you have to take cover. We hope you don't. Now, as this is a vegetable soup, it would be very ration-friendly, as fresh vegetables were never rationed, and many people were growing them in their home victory gardens. Now, they say you can use any vegetables you like, but they do recommend 1 carrot, 1 turnip, 1 leek or onion, I chose leek, 1 or 2 potatoes, a few bones. I'm using chicken bones because a lot of people were actually raising their own chickens, and because I had a chicken last night. some celery or celery tops. Then it says 4 tumblerfuls of either stock or water, but it doesn't say how big the tumblers are, so I went with 6 cups of water. About 2 teaspoons of salt and 1 teaspoon of pepper. Then a teaspoon of meat extract or yeast extract. First, wash, peel, and chop all of your vegetables, and then put them into a pot with the salt and pepper and the bones and the water. Bring this to a simmer and then set the lid on. And then the recipe says that you're going to simmer these vegetables for an hour, which frankly seems way too long, unless Gert and Daisy maybe had dentures. But it actually puts me in mind of a quote from the period, from the Ministry of Food, that said, "No country in the world grows vegetables better than we do, and possibly no country in the world cooks them worse." Then once you've simmered your vegetables, basically to the point of mush, you can add a teaspoon of either yeast extract or meat extract. Stir it in and keep the soup warm while you prepare your honey biscuits. Now this recipe actually comes from a leaflet from the Ministry of Food, specifically leaflet number 21, Making the Most of the Sugar. This leaflet was filled with recipes which, while they didn't completely replace the sugar, which was being strictly rationed, it showed you how to augment it and stretch that sugar with other sweeteners like dried fruit and treacle and honey, like we're going to use in these honey biscuits, for which you will need 75 grams of margarine, that's a little more than 5 tablespoons, 2 tablespoons of sugar, 2 tablespoons of honey, a scant 1½ cups or 170 grams of plain flour, 2 teaspoons of baking powder, 1 teaspoon of cinnamon, and a pinch of salt. First, cream the margarine and the sugar until it's nice and smooth, and then beat in the honey. In a separate bowl, sift in the flour, then whisk in the baking soda, cinnamon, and the salt, and then add that to the margarine mixture and mix until it's just combined. Then turn the dough out onto either a floured surface or a piece of parchment and roll it to about 1/4 inch thick. I like to actually roll it between 2 pieces of parchment because it helps the dough not stick to the roller. Once they're rolled out, cut them into small rounds about 2 inches across, and then set them on a baking sheet and place them in the oven at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, 175 Celsius, and bake for 10 minutes. Now eventually both of these dishes were something that could have been sold in the shelters in the tube stations. But at first, the underground was not even set up as a shelter. In fact, you weren't even allowed in. In the early days, they barred people from entering the underground stations, and they depict this in the film Blitz, and it made me ask, why was this happening? The London Blitz began on September 7, 1940, as 364 bombers of the German Luftwaffe, escorted by 515 fighters, dropped bombs on the city's East End. That night, the East End burned. The dockside was ablaze. It lit up a great part of East and Southeast London. It was a night when London was ringed and stabbed with fire. As the bombs fell, people scrambled to find cover. Some went into private shelters or other underground shelters which had been prepared, but there wasn't enough room for many people, and so they went to the nearest underground station. But when they got there, they were barred from entering. Police actually stopped them from going into the stations even as bombs were falling. Why was this happening? Well, it all turns out that it was due to a man named Sir John Anderson. In October of 1938, as the likelihood of war seemed inevitable, Anderson was put in charge of air raid preparations. His main strategy was to equip people with a sheet metal cylinder that could be partway dug into their gardens at home. It ended up becoming known as an Anderson shelter. All well and good if you lived out in the country or in a large house and you had a garden. Not too practical for most of the people living in London who didn't have a garden, especially in London's poorer East End. Well, because of this, it would just make sense for the government to build a bunch of underground shelters in the city, right? Well, not if you were Sir John Anderson, who in 1938 told the House of Commons that apart from the difficulties and delays involved in any extensive scheme for deep bomb-proof shelters, I do not think we are prepared to adapt our whole civilization so as to compel a large proportion of our people to live and maintain the productive capacity in a troglodyte existence deep underground. I guess he worried that they would become a race of mole people. Actually, it was more that he was worried that they would get too comfortable down there underground and not come up to do work, putting out fires and stuff like that, or work in general. This was something he termed deep shelter mentality. And as late as mid-June of 1940, only months before the bombing started, Anderson said, "I am devoutly thankful that we did not adopt a general policy of providing deep and strongly protected shelters." So due to Anderson's theory of deep shelter mentality, that first night of bombing, the tube stations were completely closed off and people could not get in. But by the second night, people had kind of figured out a way to circumvent this by buying a ticket for the tube as if they were going to ride the train during the day, going down, and just refusing to leave come nightfall. And eventually, people just busted in. They stormed the Liverpool Street station and went downstairs. A similar situation took place on September 14th when 50 workers and their children who had lost their homes in Stepney, the neighborhood where many of the characters from the film live, ended up forcing their way into a shelter underground, but it wasn't one of the tube station shelters, rather it was the private shelter at the Savoy Hotel. Now, despite the government's best efforts to keep people above ground during the bombings, it wasn't long before families from the East End with scraps of bedding jostled West End folks with luncheon baskets and expensive traveling rugs in underground stations in the metropolitan area last night. A woman with 4 children, she nestled the youngest in her arms, said that she and her family had been using the tube as a shelter for more than a week. "It's quiet and comfortable here after the last train goes through," she said. "We cannot hear the guns. We sleep and sleep soundly." Though even weeks into the bombings, the government was still discouraging people from using the tube stations as shelters. The Ministries of Home Security and Transport last night issued an appeal to the good sense of the people, and particularly to able-bodied men, to refrain from using tube stations as air raid shelters, except in case of urgent necessity. If literal bombs falling from the sky do not count as urgent necessity, I don't know what does. Well, eventually the government kind of threw up its hands and were like, fine, and they allowed 79 tube stations to be used as underground shelters under the administration of Admiral Sir Edward Evans, known as London's shelter dictator. Those 79 stations, along with many shelters that were not tube stations, began to be outfitted for continuous use. And he promised shelters for everyone, no queues, season tickets for 1 million nightly shelterers, and heat wherever necessary. Yes, season tickets. You had to have a ticket to use these shelters. You didn't just get to run in when the bombing happened. And the tickets were 1.5 pennies, or about 50 cents today. So it wasn't really about the money as much as about just securing a spot, making sure that there was enough space for everyone in a particular shelter. It was deemed too dangerous to have people laying on the tracks or sleeping on the stairs, which during the early days they absolutely did, so this allowed people to secure a bunk and know that they would have a place when the bombing began. By October and November of 1940, 3-tier bunks were being installed in the tube stations, as well as places to get drinking water and, most importantly, toilets, a significant upgrade from the bucket system used in the early days of the Blitz. This is also when the sale of food began to appear in the shelters because, again, during the early days, you had to bring your own food. There was actually a leaflet put out by the Ministry of Food that made a suggestion of food for your air raid shelter. If possible, hot drinks should be taken into the shelter. If you have a vacuum flask, fill it with hot soup, tea, or coffee. Plain biscuits with a handful of sultanas or a piece of chocolate are most sustaining. So are sandwiches made with cheese, sardine, or canned salmon. Children need plenty of water to drink. Barley sugar is excellent for them. While I was in London last year, I actually met a gentleman who had been a child during the Blitz, and he recalled being sent into their Anderson shelter. They had an Anderson shelter, it wasn't the underground, but he talked about some of the foods that they had, and he actually didn't remember any of the good stuff. What he remembered was that they would have to have cod liver oil and something called viral malt, which was a supplement made from bone marrow. He was not a fan. Now, something I did not think about when I was kind of first starting to research this was how to keep the dust off of the food. Because during this period, buildings which had been around for hundreds of years were collapsing. So the Ministry of Food put out a pamphlet giving instructions for protection from bomb dust. Never leave food uncovered. The thick dust which settles after blast due to a bomb explosion frequently renders food unfit to be eaten. This dust even penetrates cartons and wrapping. Cover any food which is not in boxes or tins with a thick cloth or dust sheet. This will also keep out fine splinters of glass. So in those first weeks, it was up to you to provide, hopefully, dust-free food in the air raid shelters. But by October, in that second month, there were canteens set up, run by 1,000 women with tact, common sense and ability, who will be issued with red kerchiefs to tie around their heads, red armlets, and rubber aprons, and equipped with an electric urn. From 6:30 to 9:30 every night, they will serve cups of tea, cocoa, and coffee at a penny a cup. Bring your own mugs. And cakes, buns, biscuits, chocolate, apples, meat pies, and sausage rolls. They will patrol the platform with their food trolleys for 3 hours, sleep themselves in specially provided bunks from 9:30 till 5 a.m., serve early morning refreshments till 7 o'clock, then tackle the gigantic task of clearing up the litter. It was actually those early morning refreshments that were the most important, because a lot of people went down to the shelters after work and then stayed there all night, and they had to go straight from the shelter back to work. So they needed something for breakfast, even if it was just a cup of tea or coffee. And so the Ministry of Food had a bunch of coffee stations set up around the different shelters. Coffee stalls roll up to help the shelter crowds. Sugar guarantee, I was told at the ministry today. The coffee stalls are guaranteed adequate supplies of tea, sugar, and other essentials, which they buy through the ordinary trade channels. One of the people running these coffee stalls, along with a number of canteens, was a woman named Miss Edith Gowans, and she had a team of 1,000 young women working for her. They dressed in green overalls and cherry red turbans and served coffee and tea out of long-spouted teapots. Miss Gowans is proud of her long-spouted teapots. They were designed by a London transport official, and they are the shape of an ordinary 2-gallon watering can with a long spout. Miss Gowans and her girls see to the babies' bottles, too. They sterilize them before filling them with milk and water. The great thing about these canteens was that it provided people with food even when they were down in the shelters. The only issue was that it also put a strain on some of the supplies, leading to shortages, especially for things like candy. Canteen demands. Shortage of boiled sweets is due to the enormous increase in demand, as well as to the 50% cut in sugar confectionery. The manager of one big confectionery manufacturer told me that canteens and the shelter people are largely responsible. You will find that most confectionery shops near shelters are sold out almost as soon as they get their supplies. This is because people in the shelters are buying more sweets for sustenance purposes. I love that he calls them shelter people. It's actually a lot nicer than another moniker that some people used to refer to those who did use the shelters. We shelterers at Belsize Park Tube Station are boiling with indignation at the appearance in your column on January 1 of the letter referring to us tube shelterers as yellow and as shelter rats. Yes, there was a portion of the population who considered those people who used the shelters to be cowardly and thought that it was better to just stay in your home hoping it didn't get bombed. Luckily, it does seem that that was a very small minority of the population, because as the days went on, the shelters began to be used more and more, so much so that the government decided to create some permanent shelters called deep-level shelters. 10 were commissioned, though only 8 were fully constructed. Built 30 meters below ground and stretching 400 meters in length, each shelter could accommodate 8,000 people and included permanent bunks, lavatories, medical bays, and 8 canteens in each shelter, which would serve soup, sausage rolls, meat pies, and cakes, along with hot beverages. Though by the time the shelters were finished, the Blitz had actually ended, so they were used mostly for storage throughout the war. It wasn't until 1944, when Germany renewed its attacks, this time with the V-1 and V-2 rockets, that they began being used once again. Now, this second round of attacks near the end of the war led to a renewal of the program of sending children out of the cities into the countryside, often to live with relatives or friends, but even more often to live with complete strangers. They didn't know the people. It was just people letting children into their homes. And it must have been a very difficult decision for parents to make. Yes, you're keeping them safe, but you're also sending your child away to live with someone you don't know for who knows how long, and you don't know that you'll be around when it's time for them to come back. And this is the decision that Saoirse Ronan's character Rita has to make at the beginning of the movie Blitz. Luckily, I don't have to make that kind of decision. I just have to decide whether I want to eat my honey biscuits or my Blitz soup first. And here we are. Blitz soup and honey biscuits as were served in the underground shelters during the London Blitz. So I'm going to start with the Blitz soup, which I gotta say, it smells really good, but it is mush. I mean, It's not, you can still tell that these are vegetables, but they are very, very soft, and some have actually just disintegrated. But here we go. It's actually really good though. There's a little spice to it. There's I added a good amount of pepper, I guess. But it is pretty flavorful. Also, I think that yeast extract kind of helps. It's pretty good. The texture is what I have a problem with. I would cook this maybe for like half an hour instead of an hour. An hour just makes the vegetables are too well cooked, but the flavor is really nice, and you can imagine that, you know, this would be a wonderful, hearty, warming dish to have in a bomb shelter. Now, when it comes to the honey biscuits, these also smell really good. They smell kind of like graham crackers as they were baking. They turned out very well. They're very flat, but they don't seem too hard. Let's give it a taste. So they're not super sweet because, you know, it's just a little bit of sugar and a little bit of honey, but that really allows the honey flavor to come out. I think you could use a little bit more cinnamon too. They are mild, but they would be perfect to have with a cup of tea or cocoa. And because they're mild, these are the kind of things that you can just sit there and eat like 20 of them mindlessly. They're actually pretty good and really easy to make. These are worth making. Actually, both of these dishes are worth making. The vegetable soup is very simple. These are simple too, but these are something I would actually make. Again, they're quite nice. Anyway, while I was researching this video and going through all these old newspapers, I kept coming across these different products that were for sale that would make your time in the air raid shelters a little more comfortable. And my favorite was for wall pockets for your shelter. Shorter days possibly mean longer periods in the air raid shelter, so it will be as well to make it as comfortable as possible. Space is an important consideration, so why not have wall pockets in your shelter? They are invaluable for holding all those trifling but important items which make sitting by in the shelter bearable. So thank you again to the movie Blitz, streaming on Apple TV Plus on November 22nd. It's a wonderful film and really makes this period come to life, and I will see you next time.